Welcome to a solo episode of the podcast. Thanks for tuning in. The topic today is 12 reasons that athletes plateau in a speed and performance training program. And these topics are more applicable to, let's say, the track and field sprinting, jumping, and throwing events, general speed and power training. You could also take it to individual sports like swimming. There's certainly going to be ideas that are applicable to all sports and all skill training, but these 12 barriers are very much focused on what keeps an athlete from achieving their speed and power potential. And the 12 reasons are a lack of stimulation in the training environment, too much stimulation in a training environment, a lack of creativity and novelty, lack of a plan, too much weightlifting, not enough weightlifting, and you'll notice there's a lot of pairs here, lack of a waving load or excess monotony, lack of representative play and exploration, a skill learning deficit, too constricting of a program, a lack of feeling seen and heard in the training, as well as a lack or issues with belief and motivation. So let's start getting to the first of these, which is a lack of stimulation in the training environment. And it's one thing to have those big rocks of training, you're sprinting, you're jumping, you're throwing, you're lifting weights, all of which are inherently stimulating. However, there is a spectrum of how those elements are applied. And a good way to describe this would be just to take something like sprinting. If you are sprinting and you're by yourself and you're out in a field and no one's watching and there's no timing system, that it is stimulating because it's sprinting. But compare that to sprinting in a team environment and things are timed and maybe your times are ranked, recorded, and published and sent to everybody. That is inherently a more stimulating environment or way to do sprinting than just sprinting with no timer. And there's this spectrum, as I mentioned. So you could say if you have this imaginary spectrum and on the left is sprinting with no time by yourself, every layer up you go is going to elicit really a faster time. You're going to run faster. So if you simply put a timer out, so you're timing your sprint now. Maybe you're still by yourself, but it's actually timed. If I took an untimed sprint and a timed sprint and I put a GPS on that and you weren't aware of it, but those timed sprints are typically, unless you're overthinking, going to be faster than just running fast for the sake of running fast. We also can make things more stimulating by adding tasks and competition. So if you just throw a tennis ball and chase it and try to catch it on one bounce and go as far as you can. Or if I threw a frisbee and you had to chase it down, hawk it down as fast as you could and catch it before it hits the ground. And hopefully it's a good throw. And if it's a throw that pushes you to the edge of your ability, or you're running away from someone, or you're chasing somebody, there's a task or a competitive task. Those things also make the session more stimulating. And that is a general term, but ultimately you're going to be running faster in that setting. And so there's this, again, spectrum of stimulation. Coaches will talk about a powerful workout in track and field. And that's something I've heard Chris Korfist say with a 23-second run workout for his sprint athletes. So it's as if you're taking, or it's not as if, in these powerful workouts, you're taking the power of competition as well as a task and a problem to solve. And you're really weaving it together to raise the level of stimulation. So if you look at a 23-second workout, that's where athletes are going to run as far as they can in 23 seconds, and then they'll have a cone or a marker with how far they ran. And then they get a full rest, and they'll repeat that and try to beat their distance. And in a way, you could say you're just modulating the parameters instead of just sets and reps. It's just time. But if you think about it, you're there with a group, and you ran X amount of distance and put the cone there, and then your buddy beats you by a meter. And then you want to not only your next run, ideally, you want to beat your first distance, you also want to surpass the person who ran the distance further than you. And you're sitting there watching people run, they're watching you, and there's this very clear, this is how far I ran, even more than maybe your time flashing on the board. Everyone sees the distance. So it's this thing where everyone's just visually seeing your ability. And so it really incentivizes you to push that out and push that forward. And so the way that we can create stimulus, it's the art of creating stimulus within a single training session, is a very powerful thing. I also noticed too, if you have athletes who are not in a team sport setting, so an individual sport setting, if you have track athletes or swim athletes, team sport itself and the competition and problem solving, the way that gets woven together, it's a really powerful and effective stimulus for just general gains and the generally raising the level of the human body. And I talk about this all the time, but one of the best ways to warm up to dunk a basketball is to play pickup basketball. 20 or 30 minutes, you are feeling more activated and ready to go than just about any traditional canned, okay, we're gonna do these 10 series of activation type things. It's gonna activate you, and it's gonna bring your level higher than those more traditional levels will. And in my own work online with athletes who they're not in a team sport, they want to get stronger and faster and jump higher. Athletes who are or have the opportunity to play a pickup sport once a week and sometimes twice, those athletes do very well because that stimulation in the team sport setting is accounted for. So, of course, if you work with team sport athletes or you're a team sport athlete, by nature, your sport is very stimulating. And that's the thing you will hear sports scientists and strength coaches working in collegiate and professional settings frequently talk about is sport is the most stimulating thing. But there's also something to how those practices are run. For example, if you have a football coach and it's just a lot of lines and laps and lectures and boring drills and a lot of excess conditioning versus things that are fast and fresh and explosive, that's a big deal. So that stimulus can also reside in the sport itself. But that's where pickup is so good, because pickup basketball, there's room for exploration. There's a little bit of pressure taken off. There's not as much time for strategy. It's all just explosive sport play. Of course, pickup, you're running up and down the court, and there's that aerobic stimulus, there's helpful pieces to not too much aerobic, but some level of basic aerobic to kind of wave out the explosive efforts. Anyways, all this to say, lack of stimulation. So lack of this stimulation threshold can be the thing that's keeping an athlete from breaking through to the next level of their performance. Now, when we look at these things in pairs or pairings, we can see that too much stimulation can also be an issue, but this isn't as common right away in a program. This often takes some time to see unfold because a lot of really good coaches and really good coaching systems that have had a lot of success, they're extremely stimulating systems. And a lot of it is, it's not just the sets and reps and the heavy weightlifting and those types of things, very stimulating. It's also a lot of times the intensity of the coach. There might be a very strong adapt or die type mentality, and the athletes feel it. They feel the intensity in each practice. And these systems can breed a lot of success. I've seen it in multiple settings between track and field and various clusters, be it sprints, jumps, or throws, or swimming. I've seen it. And a lot of times, though, these athletes will experience success with that coach for a time. And either A, they get past that system and they fail to progress just because they've used it all up. And that stimulus threshold is so high, to continually get up to that stimulus threshold is a very difficult thing. So that can be a main piece of that, is success for a time, then a struggle to surpass it. A lot of times I also see that athletes who have been in this type of group, there can be this almost cult-like belief in that system, in that this is the only system, no other systems are good. And it's also that belief that causes a lack of adaptation outside of it. So that does tend to be tied to these very intensity, almost just that's what you live and die by type systematic programming. So, I would say for the most part, most programs probably are understimulating versus over. I think the problem where things get overstimulating, it's more that means are just introduced too early. Like heavier weightlifting is introduced too early before an athlete is ready for it, before they're ready to maximally benefit from it. And a lot of the value of it is just it's stimulating. It's stimulating to overcome weights and see the body get generally stronger. I think that's a way that we oftentimes see that dumped in the system, or nervous system based intensive strength training and strength and conditioning program just put in a program too early, like I'm talking like middle school or even a lot of freshmen in high school, get things that are more stimulating than they need at the time when a more simple system, even a 1x20 type system, would easily do and help them sustain gains for a longer time period and threshold. So just to wrap up that pair, just think of it as a dial of stimulation and the things that you can dump in from a social and emotional and task and problem solving perspective to help really drive up that stimulus. And also, it is a personality of the coach thing. I believe in those systems that actually are overly stimulating, that a lot of that is also a coach who's super intense, but can't shut it off. I think that's the thing. You just have to shut it off. You need to be stimulating. You need that part of the equation. You just have to be able to shut it off and understand when and how to rest. And I think that's the mark of the higher level coach in these systems, that they know how to turn it on. They know how to drive that stimulus, but they also know how to rest. The final thing, and this fits with like a rank, record, publish, but just record boards. If we look at, well, what's stimulating, be it national championship banners on the wall of a successful program, as well as just record boards from various, okay, this is the highest jumps and the fastest sprints in this facility and all those types of things, farthest throws, lifting or force production based values. These are things that you get your name on the record board that's motivating, it's stimulating, and it is part of that full circle social and emotional piece. So the next pair we'll talk about is the pairing of creativity and then structure. And so I'll start with a reason that athletes can plateau is a lack of creativity and novelty in the program. And as human beings, we are wired for a constant source of some level of novelty, some level of newness. Now, I think some people are wired a little bit more than others for this, and excessive creativity can certainly get a bad rap. I think we tend to see that with really creativity and things that aren't like purely training. It's where we would say, okay, people are overly obsessed with functional training and all the ways you can get creative with all these functional and cable-based and stability ball means and going overboard there. But really, creativity in coaching and training, I see it as simply the ability of a coach to reinvent themselves in their training program and to give a very similar basics, or basically to deliver the basics in a new and fresh way. Maybe it's a change in the setting. Maybe it's a change in the order of the training. Maybe it's a gamified version of some of those basics in whatever game you're playing. It doesn't have to be, and this is where I think creativity gets excessive, is, all right, I'm constantly searching social media for some fun new exercise or drill, or I run these 4-week training cycles, and every 4-week cycles, I got these new drills that I found on social media. And I don't think that type of creativity is really that beneficial. I think there's this sustained base of work and the stimulation that comes with it. That is the core. But then just being able to reinvent the way that's presented to the athletes over time. And I think that's where a lot of times as well, athletes may transfer from one training program to another. Like their time with one coach ends and they start with another training group. And a lot of times those switches, that switch to another training group, is met with instant gains and progress. And a lot of that instantaneous gain is just simply the novelty. It's the change. It's not even just the training program. And obviously the training program is likely different, but it's the personality of the coach. It's the teammates. It's the setting that you're in and the training facilities. And I think that's why a lot of times just having a training camp, just going somewhere else to train, is really helpful and beneficial, because our minds are wired for it. And yeah, it goes beyond just the sets and reps. It's really a systemic thing. But just an example of, okay, well, what's a simple way to change things up if we want to maintain the basics and we don't want to get carried away with, too much low stimulation, just, you could say functional stuff. I heard a really good example. Lauren Seagrave, a well-known, renowned track coach, was talking about training the long jumper Dwight Phillips. And he talked about just simply changing the order of the presented exercises. So instead of going, all right, we're going to do speed first, and then we're going to do plyometrics, and then we're going to do weightlifting. Well, let's do weightlifting, then plyos, then speed. And he said that simple change, that flip of those elements and the potentiation that comes from them, drove new personal bests out of Dwight. And so it can be as simple as that, or finding a new way to, instead of warming up a few days of the week, instead of, all right, we're going to do our traditional warm-ups, maybe you warm up with a game a few times a week. And of course, you could look at how Rhett Larson warms his athletes up, and there's that very high novelty and gamification there. Maybe you're combining movements a different way in complex training versus linear. Or if you like doing a lot of complex training, you go to linear for a while. You go to, I wouldn't necessarily call it more boring, but more focused. It's turning the dial of a little bit more connective and circuit-based work where there's a lot of connections to a little bit more linear approach where you're doing things one at a time and just changing the sequences. So those are just a few examples of how you can get creative with things. I find taking a basic set of ingredients and learning how to work with that basic set is in many ways the core of creativity, in addition with the environment, more so than, all right, well, I'm just going to get really creative with all the new exercises and all the variations of exercises of things, because that can actually take you away from the core of what you're looking to adapt to. And you could even take that to, let's just say, sprinting as well. I would rather find ways to reimagine sprinting itself for the athlete in many cases, such as amplifying the air different ways, putting different analogies in, I was about to say cues, but analogies and imagery in as you're doing each sprint in a rep without rep type format. Those are great ways to be creative before you, all right, we're going to go in the weight room and we're going to do 8 different special exercises. And I think that's okay too, as long as it's not getting away from your core package. But find ways to be creative with the core of what you're doing first, and then you can zoom out a little bit to the periphery. But the ability to reinvent ourselves is really important. I look at bands and music as well. I think it's interesting that you look at bands that were loved and then despised. Like if you grew up in the 90s and the O's like me, like Nickelback in the 90s was an awesome band. Everyone really liked them for the most part. And then somewhere around the mid 2000s, people just really got sick of them. I mean, there was people who went to their concert and like threw rocks and terrible things like that. But I think a reason people didn't like them was just that there was this thought that they failed to reinvent themselves, that they always sounded the same. And I don't think you don't have to come out and be a totally different band. You're true to who you are, but to take time and find those different flavors of your programming, I think is valuable. So that isn't a really important piece of it all, with that creativity, novelty, the ability to go into our programming and find new ways to invent that core of our own programming. The flip side to creativity is, or lack of creativity, is a lack of a plan. And you could look at the two as a spectrum of sorts with, on one end, you just have pure structure. And on the other side, you just have pure creativity where every day is just creative expressions. And I think it is an important spectrum because at the core of training and adaptation is a plan. It's progressive overload. It is a structure of the week. And that's not just for the coach and the physiology that goes into the programming and keeping a coach honest with how they write each day and how they basically dump their mental resources into writing each day. But structure and a plan is also important for the athlete because athletes need to see and understand the goal of each day because it helps them, one, believe in the program and understand the actual adaptation that's happening, but it also helps them to manage their intention and their energy and their focus on the day. For example, if it's the training week before a deload and you've been working very hard for 3 weeks and you understand that the next week is easy, it makes it a little bit mentally easier to deal with feeling tired or fatigued or kind of, I could use air quotes, forcing your way through some sets and reps of a program because you know that the next week you get to unload a little bit. Or knowing that the given day is a very athletic, high-speed training day. You're going to be asked maximal, skillful, high-velocity outputs versus, okay, this is a lower intensity day. And maybe my goal of the day, since it's a lower intensity day, is how fluid can I make these movements? How easily can I hit these submaximal times or weights or whatever it is? And so having a plan, again, not only good and important for progressive overload, knowing where you're going, knowing how to write each day, also important for athlete buy-in and the management of intensity and emotion and understanding on the level of the athlete. So you have this switch between the two. You're always going to be getting coaches who have strengths on either side. But just like the idea with creativity and reinventing, I think it's also important too. You could have times where the workout is a little bit more creative, a little bit more open-ended. And then you have time where it's more structured and it's just do the work and you understand both of those things. And I think I get more complaints, or I hear more complaints, I should say, of athletes who they talk about a coach saying, well, this coach, they just show up on the day and they just kind of do whatever. And I don't think they have a plan. And I would hear those complaints more from the athletes versus the complaints I think coaches have on other coaches is the coach who's so overly structured, they've written the whole year out, like 52 weeks. And I've seen this. And if you've been through exercise science coursework and you've seen this in books sometimes, I have some books on periodization in my library where you see this type of thing is people write out. This was actually one of my projects in graduate school, write out a year plan. And I think you should. I think that's a valuable piece of the structural side. But sometimes you'll see these 52-week or 50-week or however long the season is between breaks athletes get year plans where athletes write out every little piece, every little load, every little volume of work as if this is how everyone's going to adapt to it exactly on the nose. And it is funny because that never works. People will talk, coaches talk about how that does not work. You may get 4 to 6 weeks through that 50-some week year plan. And at some point, athletes just are not going to adapt properly to what you wrote out. And the reason isn't because your plan didn't have this progressive overload written out or this idea there. But I believe it's more so because training and life itself goes or works in a nonlinear manner. So if you look at, for example, the stock market, does the stock market just go up in this nice straight line or down in this nice straight line if you watch those long-term trends? No, it's like this wavy line up and down, up and down, up and down as it climbs. Sometimes it's a big fall. Sometimes it's a small fall. And life never works in these perfect adaptation curves. And I just think that we need to have this adaptability and feeling of adaptability in the structure of our program as we go along to work with that. And so much of that is, and it can be week to week. Maybe it's throwing in a deload when you wouldn't expect it and just saying, okay, athletes are a little bit cooked. Let's get this deload week in a little bit earlier. Maybe it's even the way you frame up the days of the training week itself. And maybe there's some room to operate, such as I love Will Rattel's concept, and I'll mention this just because it's fresh in my mind, of a giant set where the goal might just be to hit 15 reps. But you as the athlete at a given weight, let's say it's 80% of your max, but you as the athlete get to pick the distribution. And maybe if you feel great, you knock out 6 or 7 on your first set, you don't have to rest quite as long, and then you hit 5 on your second set, versus if you are just dragging, maybe you just hit doubles and try to rest a little bit longer. So maybe your program can actually, I would say an alive program can have these little modifications on the day that can also allow for those types of changes. But generally speaking, the more you write out a program in advance and overly structure it, it just kind of imposes this very mechanical and robotic and stuffy feeling in every training day. So I do believe the best mix is just a mixture of those things. Many coaches just write out a month in advance and then may have the year penciled in. Hey, I know this is going to be the theme of when I get to in season and the preseason or this season of the year in general. I find that to be a pretty happy medium. You know where you're going to go. You know what you're going to do from a theme perspective. The structure is 1 month at a time. And that is one way of doing it, but I think that's a pretty happy medium. So again, you have that spectrum of just pure structure to creative adaptation. And going too hard into either one of those can be a point where you're going to hit a plateau in the program. Today's podcast is brought to you by Hammer Strength. Hammer Strength machines are designed with athlete and human biomechanics in mind. They use arcs of motion and leverage to deliver a powerful strength stimulus with little noise and maximal efficiency. When it comes to strength machines for athletic performance, Hammer Strength leads the way. Another dichotomy is too much weightlifting and not enough weightlifting. So I'll start with too much first because I think we generally live in a day where, now I shouldn't say every athlete gets enough weightlifting. A big issue with sport now is just too much specialization, too much competition, and you could liken that to too much stimulation in the sense that athletes, there's always pressure, you always are playing competitively, but there's not enough time to actually nurture your skills and explore your skills and develop skills, and there's not enough time to have a good base of physical strength. But I do see a lot that many athletes start, I won't say every, but many athletes probably start weightlifting earlier than they need to. And like Vern Gambetta has said, if you ask an elite athlete at the end of their career if there's anything that they would change or consider, and maybe if you ask them about weightlifting, it's rare that athletes would say, man, I wish I would have lifted more weights. And this again being like an example of a higher level athlete at the end of their career. But so oftentimes weightlifting is going to hit its peak where it just doesn't give you anything anymore, relevant to high velocity sport. And I will talk about not enough weightlifting here in a minute, so bear with me. But a lot of times we hear people talk about training on the level of, only on the level of force and force application or applying force. And a lot of times that resonates with, you hear they're cueing structures and it's put more force into the ground or hammer the ground or hit the ground hard. And so the totality of just only a force-centric approach is the lack tends to be the actual skill of movement, the fluidity of movement. You could say it's more the right-brained or feminine making movement connections and that ultimate unlocking of elastic energy and muscle tendons within the high velocity. Weightlifting itself initially is going to be a really powerful and good stimulus to the athlete in most situations, provided they have a good base underneath it. They have a good base of movement. If an athlete has a good base of movement and you put weightlifting onto that, it's a stimulus. It has a positive impact on muscle tissue, exhalation power, force production. There's great injury prevention elements as well. But you're going to get to a point, every athlete will get to a point where, and you can think of it as two pieces of weightlifting. One piece is the stimulation. It's the muscular, neuromuscular coordination. All those things are boosting up. The other piece is athletes can lift more weight because they squeeze themselves harder. That's part of lifting really heavy weights, is how hard you can compress and squeeze the rib cage and then force going into the pelvis. And this is part of a reason that elite powerlifters, it's as if someone took their rib cage and put it in a little bit of a vise front to back because it squeezes out internal rotation and they're very squeezed into an external rotation, a very stiff external rotation. And you want to look at the point where the weightlifting is not serving you anymore, in the sense, not that you need to abandon it by any means, but at some point weightlifting will not serve an athlete because the continued strength gains are ones of squeezing and stiffness and compression more than they are that stimulating neuromuscular coordination. And you're always going to get a little bit of both, but you don't want to get in the situation where you've exhausted all your resources on finding all the top flight ways to do super maximal loading and bands and chains and quarter squats and trying to find more explosive ways to do quarter squats or 3-inch off the ground, super heavy step ups and things like that. The goal is to find the stimulation in those and do a small dose, but you don't want to dip in the dose where, okay, now we're just compressing the skeleton. And you also don't want to rely on that continually year over year. Ultimately, the goal is to rely on the sport itself, to rely on speed itself, to rely on jumping itself, primarily more than, oh man, how can I lever this weightlifting exercise to get me a little bit more? Weightlifting is great, but there will come that point where you can overdo it and then apply too much stiffness into that system. And that's where I believe that a lot of these systems that really do very little weightlifting, maybe they don't do any, maybe they get forced a different way. A lot of times there's a lot of success there with high-level athletes who are already strong enough. They already have the force production capabilities. They already have the muscle mass. They get their confidence in playing their sport. And maybe they lifted too much and are a little too stiff. And then they do these systems that are more functional and they feel great. And then, of course, we make fun of some of those functional systems. It's really just what the athlete needs at the given time. And how do you put those together? And I really like how coaches like Matt Aldred talked about how his weight room, it's like you have the weights and you have the machines, and then you have this area that's much more free-flowing and functional or fascial and those more open-ended elements of training, if you will. And there's a spectrum of what you can do and what athletes get more of what thing. And so often we just want to only impose our preferred method on everybody. But the reality is, the more methods we learn and accumulate knowledge in, the more we can be artists and we can reinvent ourselves and reinvent training for what the athlete needs at the time. All this to say, too much weightlifting, if it only is relying on that stiffness and compression type power and force, it's going to eventually become a means to an end. And so we want to be careful in how much we introduce, how often, and we always want to have that high velocity be really the priority and where athletes really find their confidence. So the flip side, not enough weightlifting, of course. I can make this argument, but the truth and the fact of the matter is, as I mentioned, so many athletes, they're playing their select sport. They're always competing. They're not practicing enough and nurturing real skill development. And they're also not nurturing real good tissue development, strength of their bodies. And this is going to, of course, cause a lot more injuries and issues. And so some athletes just simply do not have the force production capabilities. I will say as well, weightlifting has a very unique stimulation in that where sprinting and jumping and throwing, you're absorbing and releasing force much more quickly. Weightlifting has a more strain energy style of creating and releasing force. And from a perspective of not only just muscle tissue growth, but also a level of slow strength and one that's healthy for the tendons and body and muscle awareness, that is also a good thing. Interestingly enough, I think it's interesting or maybe funny, I don't know, but how people talk about bodybuilding is so not functional. And I mean, and really it's not, it wouldn't be my preferred choice for athletes. If I had to do one thing, would be just bodybuilding style training. But there is something about the skill of really isolating a muscle and going slow enough to get a sense of how your body moves on a very close, it's a level of awareness that's hard to get with other pieces. And you could take this into any movement. Tim Anderson talks about athletes in rolling and crawling, going slow enough to really feel every little piece of the movement, where a lot of athletes will just blow through it. If you ask them to do a roll on the ground, they just go so fast, you can tell they didn't really make a whole lot of connections. Like if there was 10 possible connections they might have made one. Whereas if you go very slowly and carefully through that roll, you are going to get a lot more of the possible connections through the body. And it's really, you could say something like an extreme slow, like a Jay Schrader extreme iso and extreme slow. You're sitting with muscular tension for longer and you have more chances to make connections and find connections with the body. And so back to bodybuilding and weightlifting and the unique stimulus of weightlifting. And yes, there is that. It assists. It's a force production assistant. It's also like a chemistry set. Speed only on its own can be assisted as if a chemical reaction from multiple ingredients by adding in weightlifting. However, weightlifting on its own is generally not so great for athletes. You want the more things you have in that reaction, the more robust of a stimulus you can get. But with bodybuilding, I'm sorry I'm jumping around here. But one thing I've noticed in my own body was that if I do arms and I train arms, I get a lot of like neck and traps and like jaw. I found that this was when I was about 28, 29. I remember running the rack in the weight room at Cal once a day. I was watching CT Fletcher and, the whole like arms every day. And I was doing arms every day. And my arms got bigger, maybe grew like an inch in like a month, which is, it's not bad. But like my neck grew so much that shirts that had fit me previously, my neck actually would barely fit into those, the same shirts. And so full circle, eventually I realized that in doing those arm curls, it's actually an opportunity. How can I find a way to isolate my arms more and not turn on my neck so much? And this actually fits with athleticism because I overactivate my neck and jaw in plyometrics and depth jumps. And when I'm playing basketball and it's a pressure-filled situation, I tense those muscles up too much. So you actually can use something very simple to teach you just good breathing. Okay, how can I relax my shoulders down into this bicep curl so I'm not overactivating these upstream patterns, so I'm really focusing on the single muscle? I think bodybuilding has a lot to offer from that body awareness perspective. But again, if it's all you rely on, obviously there's going to be a disconnection. It's a chemistry set. It's all these things together. And so anyways, all this to be said, weightlifting has a very unique and important perspective with that total force equation. And it works very well. I like using it in contrast and as individual. I use weightlifting when I write my programs in many situations. In some running, I do work with athletes who do running. And I find in the population of athletes I work with for running, like 1.5 mile runs, the tactical population, a lot of them have actually lifted too much. And so we do very little weightlifting there and focus more on movement qualities. But it's always a chemistry set, and there's always that dial of what athletes need the most given their abilities and the purpose of their training. Okay, the next plateau is monotony of the training load, or a lack of a waving training load. So what I mean by this is a lot of training, well, if it has a plan, and hopefully it has a plan, a lot of times you'll see training written in cycles like 3 weeks on and then 1 week easy. Or maybe if it's like a beginner, it's 6 weeks of building loads and then 1 week of an easy load. And this is a great place to start, by the way. If you're working in structure and you're just learning training and programming for athletes, it's a great place to start. But I'm very inspired by the work of, so Boris Shako was a Soviet powerlifting coach, and a lot of his work and ideas has been, I believe, taken on by Strong First, so Pavel Tsatsoulin's organization, because you'll hear both Shako and then Strong First talk about the importance of waviness in a load, training load. And this is where I talk again about that non-linear nature of how we actually adapt to things, kind of like if you watch the stock market going up and down and the waviness that happens there. Life itself, and you could even say like a river, rivers do not run completely straight. Nothing in nature runs in a purely straight line. And even if we have 3 weeks on, 1 week off, the net totality of that is almost more of a straighter line than's optimal in many situations. And especially for more advanced athletes, the more advanced we become, the more I believe we have to tune into kind of that waviness of nature. As well as I love too how rivers, by the way, this is a little bit of a tangent, but not only do rivers not run purely straight, they also have different like depths to them. Even the bottom is going to be different. So the water is going to be flowing differently over the bottom of the river. And I just think it's so cool how things in nature can be a parallel to how we train. And so if you look at any of Shako's programs, you notice that a lot of them, at least this is my perspective, seem to work. And I think he had like a lot of different layouts. It was not just one layout. And it's actually something I would like. If there was a book with all of his training programs, someone please send me a message. Let me know. I'd love to read them all. I've downloaded several of them, and I've actually spent a little bit of time saying, okay, what was the wave he ran for a beginner or an intermediate or an advanced? But ultimately, as I've seen it, a lot of them seem to work a little bit more on a hard, easy type format. So 1 week's harder, 1 week's easier, 1 week's harder, 1 week's easier. Maybe if for a beginner, that isn't quite as much of a contrast. Maybe the hard and easy weeks are a little bit closer together in nature. There's not as much of a wave, but once you get more advanced, the waves start to become more substantial. Maybe they get more creative, back to the creativity piece. They become more subtly random or seemingly random, even though they're in total, they're really not. But I've even heard too of people who are Strong First, accredited or write for that site. I saw a good article once of someone who just talked about a dice roll, and they would just work out based on a dice roll every day. And Dan John has talked about 3 dice, where you roll 3 dice, and the first one tells you your sets and reps, and the second one your exercises, and then the third one's your finisher. So you get that, just like the river, the rocky bottom of the river. It's pretty similar, but it's wavy enough to keep you interested and have that novel creativity. All to say, to most simply put it, where I have moved in general, not always, because sometimes I do use that 3-to-1. In fact, I would say somewhat often I use 3 weeks on, 1 week off, or 5 weeks on and a week off, and things like that, especially with more beginner and intermediates. As I move with a little bit more advanced athletes, I definitely have a lot more 14-day cycles where it is that hard, easy, but it might not even be that. It might be, okay, this week's more strength focused. This week's more power focused. This week's more strength focused. This week's more power focused. And each week itself is a subtle shift in that overall theme of the week. So you could get your waviness in that manner. A long time ago on the podcast, I had Walt Klein on, and he talked about, he had 4 colors. I'm going to forget them, but it was basically like red, white, blue, and gold. I think that's it. Yeah, and the red was like a hypertrophy week. The blue was a power week. The white, one of these was a strength week, but they all had a basic different theme to them. I think the gold was like a peaking or a competition week, but he would run through each of these weeks with a distinctive theme. And again, that keeps that creative novelty running through the program. Or you could even have red, white, red, white. There's a lot of creative adaptations that you could do with that. A lot of track coaches will actually take this on in so many ways. If you look at how jumps coaches, for example, write out the progression of their season, a lot of times it starts with more of that 3-1, 3 weeks on, a week off, 3 weeks on, a week off. And then once you get into the season, it might go 2-1, 2 weeks on and a week off. And that was actually a really big shift for me when I went from 3-1 to 2-1, just instantly gains. And something about that wave, that tighter wave, and this was when I was like 24, I think I figured this out, 25, and just really getting after those 2 weeks hard, 1 week easy. That was a big shift. And then coaches will even go to 1-1, and that's maybe a little bit more like that 14-day cycle once they get in the peak of the season. So just having that in your arsenal where as things get more intense, as things get more powerful and athletes are reaching this peak level, that's where that waviness, I believe, really comes into play. So being able to reinvent yourself, again, not like you have to change out every exercise for whatever's new on social media, but I can adjust the knobs of the rate at how fast these waves of intensive work are coming in, and then they're going to get offset, and maybe there's even a little creativity, maybe there's a little bit of dice roll or creative, subtle randomness even into each day throughout the week. That waviness, that lack of monotony in the workload is key in keeping you from reaching that peak. All right, so moving on. Next, we have skill learning deficit. So this is something that I think is one of the greatest gaps in just coaching education and what we value. Going to like the idea of everything's force and force application and force down to the ground, even like vertical force or whatever it is. The contrast to that, in some ways, I think people who talk so much about those things don't look at skill learning as much, because when you're looking at the stimulation of those things, and I will say we latch onto things because there's a feeling associated with it. It feels really good to set a personal best in a weightlifting exercise. It feels really good to run a personal best in a 10-meter fly or a vertical jump. But the thing is the further you get away from just lifting a heavy weight or an isometric, really, you start to take on layers of skill. And a sprint, a flying sprint, or even like moving even further, a track and field jump, like a long or a triple jump, the further you get away from a baseline of just an isometric force output. And there's even skill to that too, by the way. There's mental skills. You could do visualization skills within that force output. But the further we get away from just pure raw strength, we start to take on layers of skill and motor learning. And I just think that's one of the biggest deficits in ultimate athletic performance is how we learn, how we put together skills, and how we use things such as differential learning and constraints and analogies and amplifying the error, which I love. I'm really starting to make that a big part of what I do. And even like contrast. So contrasting, for example, in sprinting, you're going to contrast high and low knee sprinting, and then you would do a sprint. Well, let's see how high your knees feel like they want to come up. Or contrast high frequency sprinting with bounding and then do a sprint in the middle. Notice how fast your stride length wants to be when you have to run your fastest and you've just exposed or found an exposure to the extremes. So those types of things. And more so, okay, if we're talking stimulation, because this is what so much of it comes down to. If you're a speed and power coach, you love the stimulating feeling. But you know what's also very stimulating? Yes, lifting a weight max and a PR, but setting a personal best in a flying sprint or a jump or something that's a little more skillful and complex. And when you set that personal best, you get a dopamine hit. You feel good. You feel energized. And guess what that does? It raises the level of the system. And then the next weightlifting workout you do, you're probably going to be energized and lift more weights. Andy Yeager talked about this a long time ago on the podcast with his sprinters. This was, I believe, at Kennesaw State. In the middle of the season, track season, competitive, stimulating, high speed, their power clean max would go up because they're racing fast. And the ability to race fast and set PRs and something high velocity can transfer over and filter into more weightlifting-based exercises. And where I'm going with all this is the better you get at learning, true learning, the way a child learns, and reading books like what Rob Gray puts out, and the differential learning, constraint-led approach, getting into more of the connective elements of the mind and not just saying, put your arm here, internal cues. The better we get at that, we're more likely to hit performance PRs. And you hit that performance PR in a skill, and then you get a dopamine hit, and then it actually can raise your lifting, and that cycle continues. So it does fit with the stimulus. It's stimulating to do things better and to hit your best mark because you did things better. it's also really cool just to see how your body operates with all that said and done. So I feel like a lot of times we can hit a peak because we just weren't going through the skill. A lot of times athletes are just cued and over cued robotically. It's always the same thing. Every athlete gets the same cue, the same internal cue. Do this with your arm, leg, stomp the ground, whatever. That can cause a ceiling, and it's one we can break through by a better understanding of motor learning principles. All right. The next plateau is a lack of exploration. You could also say it's a lack of representative play. And now these 12 lists are more along the lines of human performance, power type, speed type activities. And this is one that could go into sport in terms of play and representative play, basically experiencing your sport in a way that, let's just say you're a basketball player, it would be playing pickup 3-on-3 where you're exploring things, you're trying new moves. There's still the representation, the hoop's 10 feet, you have other players, but it's much more open and there's much more room for exploration. In terms of something that's a little bit more, I don't want to say finite, but less chaotic, like it's a sprint, it's a jump, it's a throw, it's having time to explore that without the constant barrage of typical cues of do this, do that, do the other thing. Maybe I can explore amplifying the air and then see how my body wants to actually do the skill. So for example, if I'm doing high jump, hey, why don't you try high jumping and don't drive your knee at all? This is actually something I wish more people would do because it's a lot of fun. And you're going to see just how high you can jump with zero knee drive or, just a few degrees of it. And that actually helps you to appreciate how your knee actually drives and helps you more than if a coach just says, yeah, drive your knee as far as you can or whatever. And there's no reference. So giving athletes explore the air allows them to actually play and explore with what happens when they're not doing the air. And again, this just goes back to motor learning in so many ways, but having a time to just explore technique and explore abilities and just play around with how you're doing the event is really important. And Stefan Holm, height overhead, co-world record holder with Franklin Jacobs. I believe it's a tie between those two. Is he had spoken about when he was a child, just playing with all the ways they could jump over the high jump bar. And that is the window for that ultimate exploration. And so many times it gets choked out and athletes are told just to do this, that, and the other thing very early and not given that room. But I also think it's relevant for when we're older because it can inject so much of that just childlike joy of exploring something and seeing the different ways I can work with it. It's also an unload. That play, representative play, just like 3-on-3 is an unload from 5-on-5, very strategical, highly competitive, pressure filled. It's also an unload from air. We're running fly 10s again this week in sprinting, and how fast can you go? It's an unload from that to explore that capacity more. And it doesn't even have to be a week-to-week thing. It could be throughout the week. There's different themes. You could warm up with exploration. I often use that strategy in warm-ups, and then you're funneling it into high performance. But that lack of play and exploration is a big one when it comes to athletes reaching that or breaking through plateaus in their performance. Very similar, and this ties to it, is performance that is just, or programming that's just ultimately too constricting on an athlete. This goes back to, just internal cues. All right, we're doing sprint drills or we're doing squats, butt back, chest out, drive like every day, same thing over and over again. Sprint drills, heel up, knee up, toe up, arms at this angle every day over and over again, very constricting. But that can also even reach into the way that loads are applied even throughout the week. For example, if athletes never have autonomy, never have a say in any of the even set rep schemes or the exercises or anything or the themes of the day. And again, I'm not saying that, hey, here's the keys athlete to the whole program, but just key points where athletes feel seen and heard and get a say in what's going on in the program. That can also lead to a plateau. I know for me, I was a very high autonomy need athlete. I needed a lot of say in the program, probably to a fault personally in many ways, but I needed that. Some athletes need less. Some athletes are just, hey, tell me what to do, I'll do it. And always. And some athletes will say that too, but inside they do, when they're given a little bit of autonomy, they do really like it. So there's different ways that coaches give autonomy. I know for me, my own example, high need, is my coach in college, my college track coach, gave the structure of the week. And I would do that structure, even sets and reps in the weight room. I would do all that. But occasionally I would switch the squats to a box squat off a 16-inch box. So not full depth. Like that would be my little switch I made on my own, just little, or maybe I would do a couple sets of step ups that weren't on the program. But by and large, it was mostly the same. But the track for the jumps, I would work out with the sprinters and then, hey, Joel, you can go do high jump on your own. So I would do my own high jump practice. Now, there was definitely a fault in that. If I was getting some quality coaching there and frameworks, that would be helpful. But the funny thing is my assistant coach, he knew what I needed. But he knew I was not the person who at the time would listen to, hey, if I was just told, hey, you do this and you're jumping. Again, me on the extreme end of autonomy in that. But he would kind of sneak it in by saying, hey, I was talking to this Russian coach, and he said this is a drill they did when they were, doing all this, whatever training. And he knew I would listen to that and then start doing that drill. And in doing that drill, I got what I needed in the jumping, and my technique transformed. And so that was a little bit overly roundabout, but I actually had a really good balance, I think, towards my extreme need and autonomy with those types of situations. A lot of coaches will have menu systems. So I like Jay DeMayo's Game Day +1, where athletes can choose from a menu. Corey Schlesinger has a menu system for his athletes. I remember when I saw it on a screen when he was working at Stanford, it was so cool. Athletes could actually touch screen select what they were going to do for exercise off a given menu. I've seen it done where one of my favorite renditions is off season. Hey, the sets and reps in swimming, the volume is set. You have to do this volume, but you get to pick the stroke you're working on in some cases where athletes got that autonomy, but then it's in season and now you actually you have to do this stroke, but now here's a few set rep schemes, a few workouts. You pick the workout you feel you need on the day, just managing that level of intensity. So at some point, there needs to be some level of athlete autonomy and contribution to the program. As coaches, we are ultimately facilitators in the journey more than we are these absolute dictators. And I do think that also goes to my early point on stimulation, intensity-based coaches those coaches are all intensity. Those coaches also tend to be a little less flexible from that programming-based piece. Okay, we'll go to the last two here. Then we have lack of feeling seen and heard in the program. This is something that was an important personal lesson for me in that when I was coaching in my 20s, it was all based on the programming, the sets and reps, the exercises, and all those things. And that was my obsession. And I think I was doing a very good job with that because the athletes at the top who are going to nationals were doing really well. But at the same time, I had athletes who were more towards the bottom, who were not big-time conference track meet contributors, who I more or less ignored half the time, and they could tell. And the interesting thing with that, well, one, it was just a source of needed personal growth for me. But I found that those athletes, there was one in particular, and I believe I've told this story before, but it was a high jumper who I ignored. And as soon as she decided to start working out with our head coach for high jump instead of me. And literally the first practice I saw her training with him, I could see she was bouncing around. She was excited. She instantly jumped 2 inches higher just because she was seen, she was heard, instead of me ignoring her. And when I eventually left the just college track coaching and went to work at Cal, strength and conditioning, that was my main job. One of the big things I realized, one of the reasons that I believe that that was a transition that really life had in store for me. It was not my dream or my conscious choice to go from track to full-time strength and conditioning. But I think one of the important elements there was, okay, you are not the main sport coach. In a sense, you're a supportive staff now. But in that, one of the things I took on was before where I would just prioritize those who made me look good because I'm the coach and hopefully the track coach and hopefully I can hand the person the medal on the award stand. Now that didn't matter anymore. And I remember something that Tony Holler had said that still sticks with me. It was at a track football consortium and it was about saying every athlete's name at practice. And I just remember going into the weight room and thinking, okay, I need to say everybody's name here. Every athlete needs to feel seen and heard by me in this weightlifting session. And slowly but surely, that setting really taught me a lot about that end of things from the athlete feeling that way. And I've talked to other coaches as to how this happens in the team sport strength coach or the sport coach strength coach dynamic. A lot of times, the sport coach is a very disciplinarian type person, especially in football, American football, everything is very orderly and structured and set, and that culture is discipline. And then it is actually the strength coach where athletes feel maybe they can let their guard down a little bit in the sense of at least talking, maybe feeling seen and heard more on the personal level, where there's more of those one-on-one, just personal, more casual feeling conversations. I've seen that in the strength and conditioning setting. It's this place where athletes can feel seen and heard in a different way many times. I'm not saying that they shouldn't feel seen and heard by the sports staff, and I think they certainly do, but it does seem to be this almost dichotomy where that it's almost more the human side of things. There is that strength development, but there's also this just chatting with your strength coach after the session, maybe about, sometimes maybe venting about the sport coach, I think does happen a lot, but just being able to be seen and heard on that personal level. So regardless of whether it is sport or strength, that did teach me so much about helping athletes feel seen and heard. And now coming full circle back, coaching high school track, one of the things I try to do, of course, mentioning every athlete's name, but I also do debrief forums after practice where athletes just take a couple of minutes and write about their practice, write about what went well, what they might have struggled with. And I like Rafe Kelly's, what's your rose, your bud, and your thorn in terms of what went well, what was tough, what was tough with the thorn, and what's your bud, what's the seed of growth you may have seen, those kind of things. But I read all those and I try to reference them back to the athletes. So when I'm talking to an athlete a session or two, I can reference that. And so, hey, I read what you wrote about the training, because sometimes if you have a lot of athletes and it's a high school session, you can't sit there with every athlete and talk about the session. So it's just a way that I've learned over time to try to make athletes feel more seen and understood. And there's that line of communication. And I'll just kind of cap this off with saying some of the best coaches I've worked with, not just like technical or structural, but like coaches in the sense of like leadership. I shouldn't say, there's different ways that we can frame up our coaching, but that leadership perspective and coaches who are seen as a really good, strong leader. In my own conversations with them, and this was as a strength coach, their attention to not just the top competitors, but every athlete on the team, or you could say like the second tier, that maybe they were more of a conference competitor, they weren't a national level, but those coaches had such importance for every athlete. And you could tell they wanted every athlete to succeed. And it's just I think it's such a thing where, okay, it's one thing to say, okay, my top athletes are doing so good, but it's another to say, hey, how can I help these athletes who are, I don't want to say the bottom, but who haven't had that high level of success, or who aren't going to outright make me look like a genius because they're winning nationals. But those athletes, maybe if I can just get them from a low, medium level to improve, to set a personal best. I really care about that just as much, or hopefully at least pretty close to as much as that highest level athlete. I do think it's difficult because when you have those elite competitors, there is something to that. But as I've seen it, those really good leaders of coaches, they cared so much about all the athletes. And it's something I've tried to take it on. It's my growth point so much. And feeling seen and heard, it can be so motivating too. I've heard coaches some athletes, I think it was Kurt Hester who talked about athletes who had struggled to put forth effort, but then when you would have a conversation with them, just on a personal level, how is life, you as a person, they feel seen and they can create that output. Finally, to put a cap on this 12 series, belief and motivation. I'll keep this short. Belief, buy-in the program, and your motivation to go through every day. How do you facilitate that? How do you instill it? And how do you cultivate the spirit of an athlete? If you're an athlete, how do you feel motivated each day? Can you chart and track your motivation? And if you don't feel motivated, how can you throw some fire onto that? Even through shifting things in your body, your even identity. Maybe you put yourself, imagine you're an elite athlete for this set and this rep, changing your story. I could talk about this one a lot more, but it's also a lot of all the lists of everything I've talked about. This is what I'm learning about the most, because our own story, our own identity, and our beliefs in the program, it matters immensely to our results. It is stimulus. It motivates us to work harder from the inside out. And it's things that we may not even feel or notice happening, but we know our body's moving well explosively. And a lot of it just relates back to our belief in the program and that motivation that goes alongside of it. So something that maybe one day I'll do an episode only about that as I grow enough to feel confident in that. But I can tell you that your story as an athlete, that the story your athletes tell about themselves and the related motivation is going to place, that is a huge potential plateau in that their story holds them to the point of where they are. And when their story changes, maybe there's some identity shifts. in the sense that you could have them pretend imagine they're an elite athlete. What does it feel to be that? Now make it your own. And that's even where saying I'm the greatest as loud as you can, like Chris Korfist and Douglas Seal have talked about. That can facilitate personal bests in a jump or a sprint or whatever. But how do you make that your own to the point where you don't need to say that and you have that ultimate belief in yourself and that change in a story? One thing I'll just say quickly before I end this one is I like the idea that an identity shift can happen, one, by being part of a group. Hey, I'm on this team. Because I'm on this team, that says something about me. So that's going to change my story every single day. It could be a reason people join the Army or Special Forces. They want an identity shift. Because I'm a SEAL or a Ranger, I am this, and it changes my story. And so just taking the time to cultivate and just consider, well, what are my athletes' stories? What's my story? And you can even look at you can look at, pieces of the training or what we do as a culture that might impact that identity, but also learning more about the athlete and what their story is and just how we go about our conversations and instilling beliefs and understanding beliefs. It's a really big part of it. It's something that there's a lot to that too. Different forms of journaling, writing, looking back and reflecting, and visualization, even like hypnosis type pieces that change your story. It's a really important part of that plateau. And I will cap this podcast off with that. Hope you enjoyed it. If you have a comment, question, you can go ahead, send me a message on justflysports.com, or you can hit Instagram, the DMs. I love feedback for these things. I'd love to hear what your plateau or thing you've worked to break through might be. And again, thank you for listening. I'll see you next podcast.